Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 1940s by Michael Goldfield. Narrated by Tom Parks. Publisher's Note: This audiobook refers to tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. This book represents a project I have been working on, off and on, for several decades. It is part of my attempt to understand the peculiarities of American politics and society, including why it is what it is today. My cut differs greatly from that of most analysts of American society and politics. As a political scientist, among my several hats, I certainly study elections and the actions of officials, elected or not. But it is my considered opinion that they are rarely the moving forces, especially in times of dramatic change, and are at best facilitators. The underlying factors, often ignored or minimized, are rooted in the economy and, in times of societal upheaval, as in the 1930s and 1940s, in the actions of social movements, particularly labor. It is my hypothesis that much of what is important in American politics today was largely shaped by the successes and failures of the labor movements of the 1930s and 1940s, and most notably, the failures of Southern labor organizing during this period. I give something of a synopsis in previous works and hope to expand it in this volume. Here, I give a brief overview of the organization of the book and interwoven themes. First, I wish to tell an important story of what I see as central events of the 1930s and 1940s, which, despite the enormous amount of important and useful scholarship, seems to me largely misinterpreted. Yet I discuss only a small piece of my research, focusing on just 4 industries: coal mining, steel, textiles, and wood. I have extensive archival material on virtually every industry in the South and most other parts of the country, as well as a wide variety of other material that occasionally makes it into my accounts. Although I mention some of these other areas in passing, dealing extensively with them would have led to 4,000 or more pages of text, with many hundreds of pages of footnotes and references. The result would have been a work which interests me and perhaps one or two others, but certainly no publisher. So I have been highly selective and have attempted to tell an engaging story. If I have been at all successful is, of course, for the listener to decide. Second, I believe that the failure of Southern organizing during this period, with its central themes of race, class, and radicalism, is the key to understanding America today. A good bit of what is significant about American politics, the political conservatism of certain segments of the U.S. working class, especially among whites, and the racial intransigence of the white South, as well much of the rest of the country, has its roots in this era. Although I have argued this point in other venues, I have changed my opinion about many facets of this thesis on the basis of deeper research and continued reflection. Third, it will soon be obvious that this is a highly opinionated work, and its theoretical orientation goes against the grain of much of contemporary labor history and political analysis. While I had originally hoped to integrate these theoretical points into the ongoing narrative, my closest friends and colleagues have convinced me to elaborate my theoretical considerations in the first full chapter of the book. Fourth, this work presents my view of how best to do careful social science. It is my opinion that research, no matter how illuminating and important, that focuses on single industries, towns, or even a single country, is not easily subject to compelling generalizations or conclusions. The only valid type of deep analysis must be comparative and global, even if that is not the main spotlight of the work, Or, as Immanuel Wallerstein once said, the smallest viable unit of analysis is the world over the course of many centuries. In this sense, this work, although its focus is the United States of America, is allied with the contemporary focus on global labor history, as expressed, for example, in Marcel van der Linden's Workers of the World. This explains, at least to some extent, what seems to be lengthy digressions from a focus on the South to national events and movements, and even international comparisons. Fifth, although cultural factors can at times be important, I find a primary focus on these factors almost always misleading. Without a clear focus on the underlying structure of economic development, and in particular, the economics of an industry, researchers are often led down the yellow brick road of fantasy. This will become clear in my analysis of struggles in the U.S. textile industry, Chapter 6, where I find the conclusions of much of the extant literature provincially presumptuous and mostly off base. None of this is to belie the importance at times of issues of race, gender, and ethnicity, which I consider central to the U.S. experience. But to look at these factors as merely cultural artifacts seems to me mistaken. Sixth, the analysis of social movements and the models for how they grow I also find generally wanting. Thus, I try to argue carefully against the preoccupation with laws, legal frameworks, and the agency of the state, at least with regard to their causal role in the growth of social movements, a position I have previously adopted in discussions of both the public sector and the 1935 National Labor Relations Wagner Act. In particular, in Chapter 2, I try to show how virtually all other researchers have been wrong on the causal importance of Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and how liberal and sometimes conservative ideological biases have led researchers astray. And, to be fair, this uncomfortable conclusion cuts across ideological lines, from the far left to the far right, and is an erroneous assumption to which I also, at one point, succumbed. Seventh, the use of data is key to understanding social phenomena, but I find much of its use analytically careless. For example, researchers at times cite strike statistics across industries with very few qualifications. I argue that these statistics must be interpreted in the context of the structure of an industry and the type of leverage workers might have. This latter theory is laid out initially in my theoretical chapter, and addressed more specifically first in the discussion of coal miners. In addition, in my analysis of the development of unionism in steel, for example, I try to show why it makes no sense to compare strike statistics in steel with those in coal, at least not without a great deal of circumspection. There is, of course, much more. Although I have published a number of articles and encyclopedia pieces on the U.S. Communist Party, I have revised my view of the party and other radical groups, with respect both to their contributions and to their problems. I reject the general tendency in much contemporary work to lump all these groups together and to talk about the left, a tendency that not only fails to highlight the differences concerning important issues and the consequences for the successes and failures of various movements, but completely obfuscates the relative weight of each of these groups. Finally, although I have argued in the past for the importance of Operation Dixie, the post-World War II failed effort by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, to unionize Southern industries, I now view it as secondary and merely a coda to the far more significant events that took place earlier, a theme on which I elaborate in Chapter 7. Introduction. America as the South and Alabama Exceptionalism. The South is today, as it always has been, the key to understanding American society, its politics, its constitutional anomalies and government structure, its culture, its social relations, its music and literature, its media focus and blind spots, and virtually everything else. The South is a distinctive, atypical part of the United States. It is also, however, America writ large, a contradiction I hope to illuminate further. The bedrock of this understanding begins not with the culture or social history of the South, but with its economy and the racial, social relations that have sustained it. W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the most penetrating and, in my opinion, greatest American social scientist of the 20th century, understood this well. Du Bois argues implicitly that the answer to the old question, originally posed by Werner Sombart, why no socialism in the United States, by which he meant, why was the United States unique among industrial countries in not having an electorally significant working-class supported labor, socialist, social democratic, or communist party, really reduces to why no liberalism in the South. The South, according to Du Bois, was inherently reactionary, so there could be no successful third-party movement in the country as a whole, by which he meant one with a left-wing labor focus, until the South changed dramatically. In a parallel argument, with little acknowledgment of Du Bois's path-breaking work, V.O. Key argues that control of the South and Southern politics revolves around the position of the Negro. Historically, it was not primarily culture or lower-class racism that maintained the system of white supremacy in the South, and by extension in the country as a whole, and led Southern political representatives to play a highly unified and generally conservative role in national politics, but the material stake of cotton plantation owners in maintaining cheap African-American labor, first in the form of slaves and later sharecroppers. The plantation owners were allied with those who gained from having a ready pool of below-market-priced laborers, white as well as black, forced to compete in a labor market whose bottom was defined by the income of semi-chattel plantation labor, as extractive workers in coal, metal mining, lumber, and other industries, among which were the textile, tobacco, longshore, and steel industries. Finally, both were supported by a wellspring of financial and commercial interests, many in the North, that benefited derivatively from these arrangements, including Wall Street financiers, holders of mortgage and loan guarantees for cotton planters, and country stores. Thus, the South historically, and still today, has always billed itself as a cheap labor, business-friendly, union-free place, currently the location of many foreign, non-union transplants. This story, of course, begins in colonial times, first with the development of tobacco and sugar crops, later cotton, all produced largely with slave labor. In this volume, I wish to probe the somewhat more recent history of the South, especially the failure during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s of organized labor to fully unionize the main Southern industries, whose success, I will argue, would have had the potential to radically transform the South and thus the nation as a whole, a central factor in our understanding of America today. I argue further that the failure of unions to organize the South during this period was not at all predetermined. What is the South? What exactly constitutes the South is a surprisingly contentious question. One of the more comprehensive attempts to address this question is that of Odom. He criticizes the U.S. Census Bureau definition, which was based on climate and geography, leading the Bureau to include, among other states, Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia, clearly not part of the South even during the 1930s. Odom presents literally hundreds of indicators in search of a definition. Many others, including Kirby, have attempted to tackle this question. I present my rough cut here. First, there is the generally agreed upon Deep South, those states with the largest African American populations and historically the most dependent on cotton agriculture: Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia. Then, with a few qualifications, one would want to add the other 6 states of the former Confederacy: North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Virginia, with the recognition that even during the 1930s, parts of Texas, Florida, and the District of Columbia suburbs in Virginia were often urban and did not share many commonalities with the rest of the South. Finally, for many purposes, I would add parts of Kentucky, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Missouri because of their similarities of income, dependence on extractive industries, and other factors, all the while indicating that no exact science for selection exists here. The South as distinctive and atypical. The distinctive nature of the South, of course, begins with the early dependence of its economy on enslaved African labor. Although slavery existed to varying degrees in the North throughout the colonial era, it was in the South that slave labor was the bedrock of the economy. At the U.S. Constitutional Convention, South Carolina delegate Rowland Louds argued, "Without slaves, this state would degenerate into one of the most contemptible in the Union. Negroes are our only wealth, our only natural resource." Between 1815 and 1860, cotton formed a majority of the value of all domestic exports. By 1860, the 12 wealthiest countries in the country were all in the Cotton South. Then, as today, economic power equaled political power. A majority of the early presidents, for 50 of the first 64 years, were slave owners, as were speakers of the House, Supreme Court justices, and president pro tems of the Senate. Southern elites controlled national politics up until the Civil War. This had great ramifications for the North. Slave owners hired vigilantes in the 1850s who engaged in the murder of white settlers in Kansas, the latter of whom wanted the territory to become a non-slave, homesteading, free state. Some argue that the Civil War really began not with the shots fired at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, but in 1854 in bloody Kansas. Slave owners sanctioned the beating, mutilation, lynching, and murder of those who challenged slavery, especially Northern abolitionists. Southern national political representatives censored, muzzled, and punished even Northern congressional representatives who attempted to present abolitionist petitions. On the Senate floor in 1856, Southern elites cheered when South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks beat the elderly Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner into unconsciousness with a cane, crippling him for life, because of an abolitionist speech he had given, much to the disgust of many Northerners. Although a federal crime, slave owner-controlled state governments censored mail from the North, destroying not only abolitionist publications, but Northern newspapers they deemed not sufficiently pro-slavery. This censorship was still going strong in the 1960s, as Mississippi television refused to show interviews with James Baldwin and Thurgood Marshall, or Nina Simone singing Mississippi Goddam. They even attempted to censor the television series Bewitched, as romantic relationships between witches and ordinary humans seemed to their enchanted minds coded propaganda for interracial sex. This legacy of slavery and white supremacy have left a callous disregard for human dignity and the sanctity of life, despite the strength of allegedly pious anti-abortion activists in the South today. It is reflected, among other places, in the distribution of death penalty executions. More than 80% of the 1,460 executions since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 have been in the South, with over half in 3 states alone: Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia. This lack of respect for human life is itself the heritage of American slavery and the plantation system. The low levels of social support for those in need, be in the form of children's health care, unemployment insurance, workmen's compensation, or disability benefits, also perhaps reflects these attitudes. The South continues to this day in general to have the lowest levels of unionization, the most anti-union laws, the overwhelming majority of anti-labor so-called right-to-work laws, and the most egregious violations of worker safety. It is not surprising that it is the part of the country with the lowest level of and lowest support for public education and health care. And it is probably far from a coincidence that Texas today, which is relatively affluent, is the state with the largest percentage of people without health insurance. In the 3-year period from 2010 to 2012, almost 1/4 of Texans had no health insurance coverage, over 55% more than the national average of 15.8%. In 2015, 17.1% of Texans had no health insurance, nearly double the national average of 9.4%. Of the 22 states with a higher proportion of uninsured than the national average, 11 were in the South. The low levels of unionization, I would argue, are in good part the reason for so much ignorance and superstition. Lack of working-class organization leads to atomization, individualism, and an increased receptivity to manipulation by dominant economic interests. As a result, the South is the region where the largest percentage of people are birthers, reject evolution, and deny the existence of global warming, evidence to the contrary on these issues notwithstanding. It is in the South that there exists increased legislative pressure for teaching creationism in public schools. For instance, the Texas bill, HB 1485, that would effectively enable teachers to teach both creationism and climate change denial. Still, many people in this region continue to glorify the Confederate flag and the lost cause, whose destruction was one of the great triumphs of human dignity in world history. It was not until 2013 that the state legislature in Mississippi finally ratified the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution outlawing slavery. As recently as 2011, a Pew poll found that 52% of Southern whites considered it appropriate for today's political leaders to praise the leaders of the Confederacy, and 22% had a positive reaction to the Confederate flag. In 1972, the state of Mississippi amended its code to celebrate Martin Luther King's and Robert E. Lee's birthdays on the same day, to celebrate Jefferson Davis's birthday and the National Memorial Day on the same day, and a Confederate Memorial Day. Until 2013, Mississippi even refused to honor July 4th as a holiday, since that was the day the Union Army defeated the Confederates at Vicksburg in 1863. None of this is to argue that the South is all bad. The South has played a significant, enriching role in American culture, with its cuisine, its home as the birthplace of blues and jazz, and much more. American literature would not be as rich without our Southern writers, some of them émigrés from their oppressive birthplaces. It is more recently the site of many great universities and research centers, some of which produce far more African American PhDs than institutions in the allegedly more liberal and racially tolerant North. 13 of the top 20 doctorate-granting institutions for black PhDs are in the South. It also has been the area where some of the country's most valiant popular struggles have taken place. Whites and blacks in many places fought slave owner-led secession before the Civil War. even engaging in guerrilla war against the Confederacy in Jones County, Mississippi. Successful interracial labor organizing took place throughout the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries under the banner of first the Knights of Labor and later the Industrial Workers of the World. The interracial labor battles of the 1930s and 1940s and the civil rights struggles of the 1950s to 1970s in the South served as inspirational beacons in the 20th century. Nevertheless, the South remains, as Du Bois so poignantly argued, a distinct reactionary region of the country, and this has been the case since the colonial era. The South as a reactionary drag on national politics. The sticking point in the formation of the Union at the 1787 Constitutional Convention was, of course, slavery. Much attention has rightly been paid to the compromise that granted Southern states the right both to pay taxes on only 3/5 the value of their slaves and to gain political representation, including on 3/5 of the number of their electorally disenfranchised chattel. But at least as important was a constitution that forbade the federal government from interfering with the use of slave labor, the buying and selling of slaves, the recapturing of runaway slaves by vigilante headhunters, and anything else that limited the free exercise of the Southern elite's right to debase dark-skinned human beings. The issue of whether Southern states had a right to reject, declaring null and void, federal policies they did not like, or even to secede as independent political entities, was presumably decided by the Civil War, although secessionists in Alaska and Texas today still seem to be accorded a respectable hearing by the national media. The acceptance of the principle of states' rights as somehow sacrosanct, rather than as a ruse for the continued exploitation and oppression of African Americans and other minorities, including immigrants today, has been an anchor in national politics. The history of states' rights is as good a case as any for rejecting the strict constructionist interpretations of American law. The constraints that the South has placed on national politics have operated in a threefold way. First, national social policies that developed much earlier in most other industrialized capitalist countries were largely illegitimate in the United States. They had first to jump the hurdle that the laws were needed to promote interstate commerce, allegedly the only legitimate national constitutional concern of the federal government. Thus, national health care, social welfare, pensions, unemployment compensation, and other programs considered in most developed countries to be part of a humane national policy have been highly restricted in the United States. Second, the states' rights doctrine cast doubt on whether national programs should be put forth at all. Finally, the concept of universalism, which would have meant the equal treatment of African Americans, was opposed absolutely. This meant that even when such programs were instituted during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, whether aid to farmers, Social Security, or Veterans Housing Administration and Federal Housing Administration federally supported mortgages, they were administered at the state and local levels by those committed to disadvantaging African Americans. Thus, the Southern states were in general so anti-labor, especially toward African American workers, and so inhospitable to universal programs, that they made broad national policies all but politically untenable. Attempts to form national labor-supported third parties, seemingly so initially successful during the 1930s, especially in the Midwest and West, foundered on their inability to gain any traction in the South. The low level of labor organization in the South also meant that unions in the North often had limited leverage when companies threatened to, and often did, move their facilities to lower-wage, non-union areas of the South, as Boeing, IKEA, and many others have recently.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?